Imagine waking up one morning and realizing that you can't remember the last time your mind felt quiet. Not peaceful quiet, not bored quiet, but genuinely, deeply still. The kind of stillness where you can hear yourself think, where a single idea can unfold slowly without being interrupted by another thought crashing into it before the first one even finishes. You try to recall when that last happened, and you can't. You go further back, months, maybe longer, and there's nothing, just noise, a permanent low, grade hum behind everything you do. And the strange part, the part that should alarm you but doesn't anymore, is that you've gotten so used to it that you've started to mistake it for normal. This is where many people are living right now. Not in crisis, not in collapse, but in a kind of slow, invisible exhaustion that doesn't have a clean name or an obvious cause. You go to sleep tired and wake up tired. You sit down to do something important and find that within 90 seconds your mind has already drifted somewhere else. To a notification you half remember seeing, to a conversation you need to have, to something you watched last night that meant nothing but is somehow still playing in the background of your thoughts. You open your phone to check the time and emerge 17 minutes later with no memory of what you just looked at. You make a list of things to do and feel a mild sense of dread every time you look at it. You have ideas, good ones, sometimes, but they evaporate before you can do anything with them. You know you're capable of more, but the gap between what you know you can do and what you're actually doing feels like it's quietly widening, and you can't find the edge of it to start closing it back. Here is what most people do with that feeling. They assume it's a character flaw. They tell themselves they're lazy or undisciplined or not ambitious enough. They compare themselves to other people who seem to move through life with more drive, more focus, more ease, and they conclude that the problem is something fundamental about who they are. So they try harder. They set more alarms. They download another productivity app. They make stricter schedules. They punish themselves for every distraction and celebrate themselves for every hour of focus, as if they've done something extraordinary, just by concentrating. And for a little while, sometimes it works, but it doesn't last. Because the underlying environment, the mental environment that's generating the fog in the first place, hasn't changed at all. What if the problem isn't you? What if the problem is what you've been doing to your brain, slowly, unintentionally, for years? Your brain is not a fixed organ. This is the most important thing neuroscience has discovered in the last several decades, and it is still not common knowledge in the way it deserves to be. For most of human history, it was believed that the brain you were born with was essentially the brain you would have forever. That after a certain age, its structure was set, its capacities determined, its wiring complete. But that understanding has been thoroughly, dramatically dismantled by modern neuroscience. The brain is not a fixed organ. It is a living, constantly adapting system that reshapes itself in response to experience, to what you repeatedly think, feel, practice, avoid, and attend to. This capacity is called neuroplasticity, and it is both the most hopeful and the most sobering thing you will ever learn about your own mind. It is hopeful because it means you are not stuck. Whatever mental patterns you've developed, the scattered attention, the anxious rumination, the low motivation, the chronic restlessness, none of these are permanent features of who you are. They are learned patterns, encoded in neural pathways that were built over time and can, over time, be rebuilt differently. And it is sobering for exactly the same reason. Because if the brain adapts to what it repeatedly experiences, then every hour you spend in distraction is an hour training your brain to be distracted. Every time you reach for your phone at the first flash of discomfort, you are teaching your brain that discomfort is something to escape from rather than something to move through. Every night you fall asleep, still churning through the noise of the day, you are rehearsing a relationship with your own mind that keeps you tethered to exhaustion. The brain is always learning, always adapting, always becoming more of whatever you keep asking it to be. The question is never whether your brain is changing. It is always whether it's changing by accident or by design. This is the premise of what you are about to explore. Not a miracle program, not a system that promises to transform everything in a week if you just follow the steps. What you're about to enter is something much more real, much more grounded, and ultimately much more powerful than that. It is a 30-day mental reset, a deliberately designed period of intentional change, built on what we actually know about how the brain adapts, how habits form and dissolve, how attention can be trained, and how the daily texture of your choices slowly assembles the person you become. Over the next 2 hours, you will understand what has been happening inside your brain during years of overstimulation and distraction. You will understand why so many intelligent, capable people feel mentally foggy, unmotivated, and emotionally reactive, not because something is wrong with them, but because of what the modern environment has been doing to their nervous systems without their awareness or consent. You will meet people who have lived inside that fog and found their way out, and you will be given a clear, week-by-week framework for beginning your own reset, one that is grounded in science, built for real life, and designed not just to make you more productive, but to help you feel like yourself again. Your brain can change. It is changing right now, in this moment, as you listen. The only question worth asking is what direction you want that change to go. Let's begin. To understand why a mental reset works, you first need to understand what's happening in your brain at the level of its most basic architecture. And to do that, we need to talk about neurons, the cells that make up your nervous system, and the way they connect to each other. You have roughly 86 billion neurons in your brain. Each one is capable of forming thousands of connections with other neurons, creating an almost incomprehensibly vast network of pathways through which information travels as electrical and chemical signals. Every thought you have, every memory you hold, every habit you practice, every emotion you feel, all of it corresponds to specific patterns of activation across this network. When neurons fire together repeatedly, the connections between them strengthen. When they stop firing together, those connections weaken and eventually fade. This is the cellular basis of learning, memory, and habit. It is often summarized in a phrase coined by neuropsychologist Donald Hebb: neurons that fire together, wire together. What this means in practical terms is that your brain is continuously sculpting itself based on what you do. Every time you perform a behavior, every time you react to stress in a particular way, every time you reach for your phone out of habit, every time you sit and focus on a difficult task, every time you practice gratitude or ruminate in worry, you are reinforcing particular neural pathways. The more you travel a pathway, the more established it becomes. It becomes faster, more efficient, more automatic. This is why practiced skills feel effortless, while new ones feel awkward. This is why habits feel natural while new behaviors feel forced. The brain has simply built stronger roads in certain directions. Now here is where neuroplasticity becomes relevant, not just as a biological fact, but as a personal reality you need to sit with. Because what it means is that you have been building roads in your brain for your entire life. And some of those roads are serving you beautifully, leading you toward focus, connection, health, and creativity. But others, and this is what most people never examine, lead somewhere much less helpful. They lead toward distraction, reactivity, self-doubt, avoidance, and mental noise. And the problem is that once a road is well established, once a neural pathway has been strengthened through years of repetition, it doesn't just stop being the default route, simply because you'd prefer it to be different. It keeps drawing you back, because it is the path of least resistance in your neural architecture. This is why willpower alone is not enough. People often believe that if they just want change badly enough, if they try hard enough, they will be able to overwrite their habits through sheer force of determination. And there are moments when this works, especially in the short term. But willpower is a limited resource. Research by psychologist Roy Baumeister and others has demonstrated that self-regulatory capacity depletes throughout the day, a phenomenon sometimes called ego depletion. The more decisions you make, the more temptations you resist, the more effort you exert on self-control, the less capacity you have left later. This is why you can have excellent intentions in the morning and find yourself making choices by evening that you can't fully explain. Lasting change doesn't come from trying harder. It comes from changing the environment, both the external environment around you and the internal environment inside your mind, so that the neural pathways you want to strengthen are the ones you're activating most frequently, and the ones you want to weaken are the ones you're allowing to go quiet. Now let's talk about habit loops, because understanding them is essential to understanding how your current patterns formed and how they can be changed. A habit loop has three components: a cue, a routine, and a reward. The cue is a trigger, a sensation, a time of day, an emotional state, a location, a person that activates the loop. The routine is the behavior itself. The reward is the outcome that reinforces the behavior and teaches the brain that this particular response to this particular cue is worth repeating. Over time, this loop becomes increasingly automatic. The cue fires, and before you've consciously decided anything, you're already halfway through the routine. This is why you reach for your phone without thinking. At some point, a cue, boredom, a flash of anxiety, a moment of transition, even just the physical presence of the device, activated a routine of scrolling, which produced a reward of mild stimulation or momentary relief, and the loop solidified. Now the cue fires, and the behavior follows almost reflexively, with very little space between them for conscious choice. Understanding this is not about blaming yourself. It's about understanding the mechanism. Because if you know how the loop works, you can start to intervene in it, not by overpowering it through willpower, but by changing its components. You can alter the cue. You can substitute the routine. You can examine whether the reward you're actually getting is serving the life you want to be living. And here is where dopamine enters the story, because it is central to all of this. Dopamine is a neurotransmitter, a chemical messenger that plays a profound role in motivation, learning, and reward. For years, dopamine was understood primarily as the brain's pleasure chemical. But more recent research, particularly from neuroscientists like Robert Sapolsky and Kent Berridge, has refined this picture significantly. Dopamine is not, strictly speaking, the chemical of pleasure. It is the chemical of anticipation, of the wanting, the seeking, the pursuit of a reward. The actual experience of pleasure is mediated by different systems. What dopamine does is motivate you to pursue. It fires in response to cues that predict reward, creating the drive to seek the thing that might feel good. This distinction matters enormously for understanding what the modern world has done to your motivational system, because the modern world, smartphones, social media, news feeds, streaming services, notifications, is not designed to make you feel satisfied. It is designed to keep you in a state of constant, unresolved anticipation. Every notification might be something important. Every scroll might reveal something interesting. Every click opens onto a new possibility. This is the perfect architecture for maximum dopamine activation, and it is extraordinarily effective. Not at producing satisfaction, but at producing the compulsive need to keep seeking. The result is a motivational system that is constantly activated by low-stakes, high-frequency stimulation, and as a consequence, finds it increasingly difficult to generate the same enthusiasm for activities that require patience, delay of gratification, and sustained effort. This is why long, focused work feels so hard to begin. This is why a book feels less engaging than it used to. This is why goals that used to feel exciting now produce mostly a vague sense of anxiety and inertia. It is not that you've lost your capacity for depth. It is that your dopamine system has been calibrated by years of constant small hits to expect stimulation that is immediate, varied, and effortless. The slow, deep, meaningful things, the work, the relationships, the creative projects, the long-term goals, still matter to you, but your brain's motivational architecture has been slowly tuned away from them. The good news, and there is good news here, is that this calibration can be reversed. The brain's reward system is plastic too. By intentionally reducing high stimulation, low value inputs and gradually reintroducing the satisfaction that comes from sustained effort and real accomplishment, you can recalibrate your dopamine system over time. This is not easy. It requires the willingness to sit with discomfort, to tolerate the restlessness that comes when the constant stimulation is removed. But it is profoundly possible, and it is one of the central mechanisms through which a 30-day mental reset begins to change your brain. Attention is the third piece of this architecture, and it deserves its own examination. Attention is not simply your ability to concentrate. It is the fundamental mechanism through which your subjective experience is created. What you attend to becomes your life. The psychologist and philosopher William James said this well over a century ago, and modern neuroscience has validated it in remarkable detail. The brain does not simply receive experience passively. It actively constructs experience based on what it is directed to attend to. This means that where you habitually place your attention, what you dwell on, what you notice, what you return to again and again, is not just a feature of your personality. It is a kind of architecture for your inner life, and attention, like any other neural capacity, is trainable. Research on meditation, mindfulness, and focused practice consistently shows that people can learn to direct their attention more deliberately, to hold it on a chosen object for longer, and to notice more quickly when it has wandered. These are learnable skills with measurable neural correlates. Actual changes in brain structure and function associated with the practice of attention training, but they require practice. And in an environment designed to fragment and capture attention at every turn, that practice has never been more necessary or more difficult. This is the landscape you are working within, a brain that is plastic and constantly adapting, habit loops that have been built over years and run largely on autopilot, a dopamine system that has been calibrated by modern stimulation toward the shallow and the immediate, and an attentional capacity that has been pulled in 1,000 directions simultaneously for so long that sustained focus feels like an exceptional state rather than a natural one. Understanding this landscape is not about feeling defeated by it. It is about understanding what needs to change and why. Because when you know what's actually happening inside your brain, you stop blaming yourself for being broken, and you start recognizing the specific, targeted changes that can begin to turn this around. Now let's look at what you're working against more specifically. Because the modern environment is not a neutral backdrop, it is an active force operating on your brain in ways that deserve much closer examination. In 2007, the average person spent roughly 18 minutes per day on their phone. By the early 2020s, that number had climbed past 4 hours for most smartphone users, and significantly higher for many. This is not a moral judgment about technology. Technology has produced remarkable gifts: access to information, connection across distance, tools for creativity, and work that previous generations could barely imagine. But the shift in how we inhabit our own attention as a result of constant digital access has been profound, and in many respects damaging in ways that are only beginning to be fully understood. The human attentional system did not evolve for this environment. It evolved in a world where stimulation was intermittent, where periods of high activity alternated with periods of genuine quiet, where the information available at any given moment was limited to what could be seen, heard, and touched in the immediate physical environment. The nervous system developed a baseline, a resting state, in which the mind could wander, consolidate, integrate, and restore. This was not laziness or inefficiency. It was essential cognitive housekeeping. The brain's default mode network, the network that activates when you're not focused on an external task, is responsible for things like autobiographical memory consolidation, future planning, social cognition, creative insight, and the processing of emotional experience. When you are constantly stimulated, constantly consuming, constantly attending to something external, this network never gets the activation it needs, and its functions suffer. There is a concept in cognitive psychology called attention residue, named by researcher Sophie Leroy. When you switch from one task to another, or, more accurately, when your attention is pulled away from one thing to something else, part of your cognitive resources remain allocated to the previous task. They don't fully shift. This residue accumulates when you're constantly context switching, when notifications interrupt your focus, when you're simultaneously managing multiple streams of information. The result is that at any given moment, your working memory and attentional resources are split across numerous unresolved threads, leaving less capacity available for the task in front of you. This is one reason focused work feels so cognitively expensive in the modern environment. It's not that you're doing one hard thing. It's that you're doing one hard thing while simultaneously holding 30 other half-finished cognitive threads that keep pulling at you, And then there is information overload, the sheer volume of content, opinion, news, data, and narrative that the modern environment asks you to process every day. The human brain was designed to handle a certain amount of information, and when that amount is exceeded, a predictable set of responses follows. Decision quality degrades, cognitive bandwidth narrows, the capacity to distinguish between what matters and what doesn't. What psychologists call signal to noise discrimination deteriorates. You find yourself expending enormous cognitive energy processing information that has no bearing on your life and no impact on your decisions, while simultaneously finding it harder to think clearly about the things that actually matter to you. This is the phenomenon sometimes called decision fatigue, and it extends well beyond formal decisions. Every piece of information your brain encounters is in some sense a micro-decision. Do I need to know this? Does this require a response? How does this fit with what I already believe? Is this a threat or a non-threat? The brain runs these assessments constantly and largely below the threshold of conscious awareness. And when the volume of incoming information exceeds a certain level, this processing system becomes chronically overtaxed, producing the mental exhaustion that so many people experience as a baseline feature of daily life, rather than as a response to exceptional circumstances. Social media adds another layer to this that is worth understanding carefully. Social comparison, the tendency to evaluate yourself in relation to others, is a deeply ingrained human cognitive process rooted in our evolutionary history. As social creatures for whom status and belonging were matters of survival, social media has transformed this process by giving everyone a curated highlight reel of other people's best moments, achievements, relationships, and lives delivered in an uninterrupted stream throughout the day. The result is a cognitive environment in which your brain is continuously performing social comparison against a version of other people's lives that doesn't actually exist, and finding itself perpetually on the losing end of that comparison. Research has consistently linked heavy social media use with increased rates of anxiety, depression, loneliness, and reduced self-esteem, particularly among younger people, but across age groups more broadly. And underneath all of this, underneath the distraction, the information overload, the comparison, the constant stimulation, is a more fundamental problem with the architecture of instant gratification. The modern world has created a relationship between desire and satisfaction that is almost instantaneous. You want something, and with a few taps, you can often have it. You want entertainment, information, connection, validation, food, virtually any material object. And the gap between wanting and having has been compressed to near zero. This is obviously convenient, but it has a significant cognitive cost, which is that it trains the brain away from the capacity to tolerate delay, to work towards something over a sustained period, to find satisfaction in the process, rather than just the product. This matters because almost everything meaningful in life requires exactly that capacity. Meaningful work requires sustained effort over time. Deep relationships require patience, investment, and the willingness to stay through difficulty. Physical and mental health require consistent daily practice over weeks and months and years. Creative mastery requires thousands of hours of imperfect effort before it produces anything worth showing. The very things that most people identify as most important to them, the things they would point to if you ask them what they want their lives to be about, are precisely the things that the modern environment trains the brain away from the capacity to pursue. This is not a conspiracy. No one sat down and deliberately designed a world that would make human beings miserable. But the incentive structures that drive the attention economy, the business models built on capturing and holding human attention, have produced an environment that is extraordinarily effective at short-term engagement and profoundly indifferent to long-term human flourishing. Understanding this is important, not because it produces despair, but because it produces clarity. You are not failing to focus because you are weak. You are struggling to focus because you are a human being with a normal human nervous system living inside an environment that was optimized for engagement rather than for your well-being. And when you understand that, the path forward becomes clear. Not more willpower, not stricter self-discipline imposed through punishment, but a deliberate reconstruction of your environment, both external and internal, that creates the conditions for your brain to function the way it is actually capable of functioning. Let's talk about Elijah. Elijah was 34 years old, and from the outside, there wasn't much to point to as obviously wrong. He had a job he'd worked hard to get and was reasonably good at. He had an apartment he was proud of, a group of friends he'd known for years, a collection of interests and half-formed plans that he could articulate when asked. By the conventional markers of adult life, he was doing fine. He knew he was doing fine, and he felt guilty that knowing this wasn't enough to make him feel better. The problem was harder to name than that. It was more like a texture to his days, a flatness, a sense of moving through everything at a slight remove. As if his life were happening just behind a pane of glass, and he was watching it rather than living it. He'd noticed it getting worse over the past couple of years, though he couldn't have told you exactly when it started or what had triggered it. Things that used to feel satisfying, finishing a project, spending an evening with friends, exercising, even reading a book he'd been genuinely looking forward to, now produced a kind of muted echo of the feeling they were supposed to produce. Not nothing, exactly, but less than they used to. He'd talked about it with a friend once, carefully, feeling his way through an explanation that he wasn't sure quite captured it. The friend had nodded and said something about burnout, and maybe that was right, though Elijah wasn't sure he felt burned out in the way that word usually suggested. He wasn't exhausted by too much work, exactly. He was exhausted by something harder to locate, a continuous low-grade mental noise that never fully resolved. A sense of being slightly behind himself all the time. His mornings had become a study in inertia. The alarm would go off, and he'd reach for his phone, while still mostly asleep, a movement so automatic he often couldn't remember deciding to do it. He'd lie there for 20, sometimes 30 minutes, scrolling through news, social media messages, weather, whatever had accumulated overnight, absorbing information about things that had nothing to do with his life, carrying other people's crises and opinions and highlight reels into the first quiet minutes of his day, before he'd even had a chance to think a complete thought. By the time he finally got up, some essential quality of the morning had already been spent. Work was difficult in a different way. His job required sustained concentration, the kind where you needed to hold a complex problem in mind for long enough to actually think about it, to turn it over, to find something unexpected in it. He used to be good at this. He could remember a time when he'd get absorbed in a difficult piece of work and look up to find that 2 hours had passed without him noticing. Now he was lucky to get 20 minutes before the pull started. The pull toward checking email, refreshing a tab, responding to a message that could have waited, glancing at his phone for no identifiable reason. He'd catch himself doing it and feel a spike of irritation, force himself back to the task, and then find himself drifting again before the irritation had fully faded. He'd tried different things. He'd downloaded apps to block distracting websites, and then unblocked them because he told himself he needed them for something specific, and then hours later realized the something specific had been a convenient excuse. He'd tried turning his phone off during work hours and managed it for a day and a half before the anxiety of being unreachable became its own distraction. He'd made schedules, detailed and color-coded, and followed them for 3 or 4 days before the gap between the schedule and reality became too discouraging to look at. Nothing stuck because nothing went deep enough. He was trying to modify behavior without understanding the system the behavior was emerging from. There was an evening he remembered in particular, though in retrospect, it was not really unusual. Just the evening he finally paid enough attention to notice what was actually happening. He'd gotten home from work intending to spend the evening on something he actually wanted to do. Sketch out the outline for a project he'd been thinking about for months, a side project that mattered to him in a way his day job didn't quite manage. He changed his clothes. He made himself something to eat. He sat down at his desk and opened his laptop, and then he opened a browser tab to check one thing quickly, and then another tab, and then his phone buzzed and he looked at it. And then he was watching a video that had appeared in a feed and that he wasn't particularly interested in, but kept watching anyway. And then it was 11:30, and the outline had never been started, and tomorrow he would tell himself he'd do it after work. He sat in his chair for a while after he realized what time it was, not quite believing it. Not angry, exactly. More like a person who has just noticed that they've been sleepwalking. Where had he gone? Who was making these choices? It hadn't felt like choosing. It had felt like being carried along by a current he hadn't noticed until he looked up and found himself somewhere he hadn't meant to be. He thought about the project he hadn't worked on. He thought about how many evenings in the past year had gone the same way. He did a rough calculation in his head, not exact, but in the right neighborhood, and the number came out to something that made him feel genuinely sad. Not self-pitying, not dramatic, just quietly sad. All those evenings, all that time, all that potential conversation he'd been having with himself about who he wanted to be and what he wanted to make, gone before it could become anything. It was not a dramatic moment. There was no sudden clarity, no resolution, no decision made and committed to. He just sat there for a while, feeling the weight of it, and then went to bed. But something had shifted slightly in how he saw his situation. A small recalibration in his understanding of what was happening to him and why. He had been blaming himself. He realized he had been reading his distraction and inertia as character failings, evidence of some fundamental lack of seriousness or drive. But sitting there in the quiet of his apartment at 11:30, the outline still blank on his screen, he began to suspect for the first time that the story was more complicated than that. That the choices he was making, or rather, the choices that were being made through him, weren't random or simply weak. They were the output of a system, a set of patterns that had been building for a long time, and systems, unlike character, could be changed. He didn't know yet how to change them. But he was beginning to understand that the question wasn't what was wrong with him. The question was what needed to change. Over the weeks that followed, Elijah began to pay a different kind of attention to his days. Not a judgmental attention, not a critic watching for failures to add to the list of evidence against himself, but a genuinely curious one. He started to notice things he hadn't noticed before, or hadn't noticed consciously. He noticed that he reached for his phone most reliably at specific moments. When he was making the transition between one task and another, when something he was doing became difficult, when a thought arose that he wasn't ready to follow, he noticed that the scroll happened most reliably in the evenings, beginning around 7 or 8 o'clock, when the day's productive energy had faded and something restless took its place. He noticed that his focus was best in the morning, before the noise of the day had accumulated, and worst in the mid-afternoon, when everything seemed to slow to a slog. None of this was revolutionary knowledge, but it was different from knowing it abstractly and actually noticing it in real time, in your own life, as it happened. And noticing it created something small but important, a sliver of space between the cue and the automatic response. Not always, not reliably, but sometimes, enough times that he could begin to ask, in that space, whether this was what he actually wanted to do. This is the beginning of any real change, not a dramatic decision or a comprehensive overhaul, but the cultivation of awareness. And it is where a mental reset must always start. The first week of a 30-day mental reset is not about discipline. It is not about eliminating bad habits or installing new ones. It is about something that sounds simpler and is actually harder. Paying honest attention to where you currently are. This matters because most people attempting to change their behavior skip this step entirely. They decide what needs to be different, and they try to force the difference through willpower, without ever clearly understanding the patterns they're trying to change. And without that understanding, change is blind, inefficient at best, counterproductive at worst. The first thing the first week asks of you is to observe. To spend 7 days watching your own mind with the same curiosity you might bring to something genuinely interesting you're encountering for the first time. Because your mind is interesting, profoundly so, and most people spend very little time actually examining how it works. Start with your attention. For a single day, without changing anything, simply notice where your attention goes. How long does it stay with one thing before it moves? What draws it away? What brings it back? This is not an exercise in self-criticism. It is a fact-finding mission. You are mapping the current terrain of your mind, and maps require accuracy, not judgment. You'll likely discover things that surprise you. Most people, when they start this exercise, dramatically underestimate how fragmented their attention has become. They think they're fairly focused, fairly present, fairly in control of where their minds go. And then they actually watch, and they find that in a single hour their attention has moved from their work to their phone to a memory, to a worry, to a sound outside, to a task they forgot to do, to a plan they haven't made yet, to the work again. And this cycle has repeated many times without any clear conscious direction. This is not a failure. This is simply what an untrained, overstimulated mind does. Seeing it clearly is the first necessary step toward changing it. The second area to examine in this first week is your consumption patterns. Not food, though that matters too, but information and stimulation. How much content are you consuming in a given day? When does it start? What triggers the impulse to consume? What do you feel immediately before reaching for your phone or opening a browser? There is often something there, a micro sensation of discomfort, boredom, or unease that precedes the automatic response. Learning to catch that sensation, to name it, to feel it for a moment before acting on it, is enormously valuable, because in that moment of recognition, you have choice. And choice is where change lives. Mental clutter is another thing worth examining this first week. The mind accumulates unfinished items, tasks not completed, decisions not made, conversations not had, promises not kept, worries not resolved. And each of these creates a small but persistent cognitive load. Psychologist David Allen, in his work on productivity, describes this as open loops, unresolved threads that the brain keeps returning to in an attempt to prevent them from being forgotten, drawing on cognitive resources that would otherwise be available for more meaningful engagement. Identifying your open loops and finding a way to either close them or give them a proper home in a system you trust to hold them is one of the most effective form of mental decluttering available. It doesn't resolve them, but it gives them a place to live outside your head, which frees up the cognitive space they've been occupying. And in this first week, begin reducing, not eliminating, but genuinely reducing, your consumption of mental junk. The news that you check 10 times a day, when checking it once would leave you equally informed. The social media scrolling that isn't connecting you to people you care about, but is simply filling the spaces between things. The television you watch passively because you're too tired to do anything else and too stimulated to rest. You don't need to eliminate any of this cold turkey, but begin to make the consumption more intentional. When you reach for a source of stimulation, pause long enough to ask yourself whether this is what you actually want or whether you're simply following a reflex. The pause itself is valuable, regardless of what you do afterward. You are beginning to insert conscious awareness into what has been operating as a purely automatic process. Sleep deserves specific attention in this first week because the relationship between sleep and cognitive function is so fundamental that nothing else in this reset will work well without it. Sleep is not simply the absence of wakefulness. It is an active, complex, biologically essential process during which the brain consolidates memories, clears metabolic waste products through the glymphatic system, regulates emotional responses, repairs neural connections, and prepares the attentional and motivational systems for the following day. Chronic sleep deprivation, which in modern life is often defined as consistently getting less than 7 hours, has been shown to impair cognitive performance in ways that are remarkably analogous to being mildly intoxicated, and which the sleep-deprived person is typically unable to accurately assess, because the impairment itself affects the capacity for self-evaluation. If your sleep is compromised, it needs to become a first priority, not because it is a luxury or a lifestyle optimization, but because every other effort you make to improve your mental function will be operating at a fraction of its potential if your brain is chronically under-rested. This first week is about honest seeing, about turning toward your own patterns without flinching and without judging, and simply understanding them clearly enough to begin working with them intentionally. The changes that come from that understanding will be more durable and more effective than anything you could impose on yourself through willpower and self-criticism. You cannot navigate terrain you haven't mapped. This week, you are making the map. By the second week, you have an honest picture of where you are. You've watched your attention move through a day. You've noticed the cues and automatic responses that make up the texture of your habits. You've perhaps begun reducing some of the mental noise. Now the work shifts from observation to reclamation. This week is about taking back your focus. Let's be precise about what focus actually is. Focus is not the ability to think about something without distraction. That is a popular definition, but it understates the cognitive operation involved. Focus, in its deeper sense, is the capacity to sustain attention on a chosen object for long enough that something interesting happens in your relationship with it. Long enough that you begin to understand it in ways that weren't available to you initially. Long enough that novel connections form, unexpected questions arise, and genuine insight becomes possible. This kind of engagement, what psychologist Mihaly Csikszentmihalyi famously called flow, is not just a productivity tool. It is one of the most profoundly satisfying experiences available to a human mind. The feeling of being completely absorbed in something is exactly challenging enough to require your full engagement, is one that people across culture and throughout history have consistently described as among the most meaningful of their lives. And it is becoming rare. Not because humans have lost the capacity for it, but because the conditions it requires, sustained, uninterrupted time in which the mind can reach the depth of engagement where flow becomes possible, are increasingly difficult to create and protect. This week is about creating those conditions. The first thing to understand about reclaiming focus is that it cannot be forced. Concentration is not a state you can will yourself into by trying harder. It is a state that emerges from the right conditions. And the most important of those conditions, the one that everything else depends on, is the removal of what competes for your attention. This is why a dedicated environment matters so much. When your workspace contains your phone, visible and reachable, a portion of your attentional resources is continuously allocated to monitoring it, even when you're not consciously thinking about it. Research by Adrian Ward and colleagues found that merely having your smartphone within eyeshot, even face down, reduces available cognitive capacity. The device doesn't need to produce a notification to be a distraction. Its presence is enough. So this week, you begin creating physical environments for focused work. You identify when and where your focus is most naturally available. The times and places where your cognitive resources are at their fullest. And you begin protecting those windows deliberately. For most people, this is in the morning hours, before the accumulation of decisions and interactions that the day brings. You may have 2 hours of genuine high-quality focus available in a morning. Those 2 hours are your most precious cognitive resource. They should not be spent processing email or attending to other people's agendas before you've given them to the work that matters most to you. Monotasking, the deliberate practice of doing one thing at a time, is another central practice of this second week. Multitasking is a compelling idea, but a neurological impossibility, at least for complex tasks. What we experience as multitasking is in reality rapid task switching, moving attention quickly between 2 or more things. And each switch carries a cost in the form of the attention residue we discussed earlier. The constant context, switching that characterizes modern work, and life is cognitively expensive in ways that most people never account for, because the cost is distributed in small increments across the day rather than appearing as a single large charge. But it accumulates, and by the end of a day spent multitasking, the cognitive toll is significant. The antidote is practicing monotasking with genuine intention. When you are working, and only that. When you are having a conversation, you are having that conversation, and only that. When you are eating, not eating and scrolling and half watching something on a screen. This sounds simple. It is not. The pull toward simultaneous stimulation is strong, especially at first. And the discomfort of doing just one thing, without the background noise, without the secondary input, can feel significant. But it is in that discomfort that something important is happening. The neural pathways associated with sustained, single-pointed attention are being reactivated and strengthened, while the pathways associated with compulsive context switching begin to quiet. Time blocking deserves attention here as well. Research on cognitive performance consistently shows that blocked, uninterrupted time produces dramatically better output than the same total time spent in fragmented attention. Cal Newport, in his work on deep work, identifies the ability to focus without distraction on cognitively demanding tasks as one of the rarest and most valuable skills in the modern economy, and one that is becoming rarer as the demands on our attention increase. The ability to protect blocks of time for focused work is not a productivity hack. It is a fundamental reclamation of your own cognitive capacity. This week also asks you to examine your relationship with boredom. Boredom has become almost pathological in the modern context, something to be eliminated at the earliest opportunity through the nearest available stimulation. But boredom is not empty. Research by Sandy Mann and Rebecca Cadman at the University of Central Lancashire found that boredom enhances creative thinking, presumably because the restless mind, searching for something to engage with, begins to generate its own internal connections and associations. The experience of mild boredom, the discomfort of having nothing to attend to from the outside, is actually productive, in the same way that fasting can be productive for certain physiological processes. It creates a kind of cognitive demand that drives internal resource generation. When you eliminate all boredom through constant stimulation, you eliminate this. The mind never has to generate its own engagement. It never practices the internal searching that produces creative insight and novel connection. Tolerating boredom, sitting with it for a few minutes instead of immediately eliminating it, is a surprisingly powerful practice. It is also one of the most direct ways to begin retraining your nervous system's relationship with discomfort, which is foundational to almost everything else in this reset. This week, begin practicing intentional reading, not skimming, not reading with your phone face up beside you. Reading with full attention, with the phone in another room, for a sustained period without interruption. This matters not just because reading is valuable, but because it is one of the most effective practices available for training sustained attention. Reading a book requires you to hold a continuous thread of thought and follow it for an extended period, exactly the cognitive skill that years of fragmented digital consumption has been weakening. If you find it difficult at first, if 20 minutes of uninterrupted reading feels effortful in a way you don't expect, that difficulty is valuable information about where your attentional capacity currently stands. and it will get easier with practice. This is what training looks like. By the end of the second week, you are not a different person, but you are beginning to have a different relationship with your own attention. You are noticing when it wanders. You are practicing bringing it back. You are creating environments and conditions that make sustained focus more available, and you are beginning to experience, in small but real ways, the satisfaction that comes from being genuinely present with one thing. The quiet pleasure of a mind that is where it means to be. The third week is where the real architecture of change begins to solidify, and where the science of habit formation becomes not just interesting, but deeply practical. Because the goal now is not just to make better choices. When you're paying conscious attention, the goal is to begin rewiring the default. To start building new neural pathways so well traveled that they begin to feel natural, automatic, and even preferable to the patterns you're moving away from. This is how lasting change actually works. Not through a heroic act of willpower sustained indefinitely, but through a process of gradual replacement in which new behaviors are practiced so consistently that they begin to generate their own momentum, their own automatic quality, their own sense of rightness. To understand this, return for a moment to the habit loop. Remember that a habit consists of a cue, a routine, and a reward. And remember that habits don't disappear when you stop performing them. Their neural pathways weaken and fade, but they don't vanish. The most reliable way to stop an unwanted habit is not to eliminate it through force, but to replace it. To use the same cue, the same trigger, but to follow it with a different routine that produces a sufficient reward to make the substitution sustainable. This is the insight at the core of what psychologist Charles Duhigg calls the golden rule of habit change. This week, you identify the specific habits you most want to change, the behaviors that most consistently drain your energy, fragment your focus, or pull you away from the person you want to be. And you design targeted replacements for each one, not punishments, not prohibitions, replacements when the cue fires, when boredom arises or anxiety, or the transition between tasks. You have a prepared alternative, a specific behavior that you can move into automatically, that produces a real reward, and that moves you in the direction you want to go rather than away from it. The role of identity in this process is significant and worth dwelling on. Research by social psychologist Wendy Wood and others on habit formation has highlighted that the most durable behavior changes are often those that connect to a person's sense of who they are, rather than just what they want to accomplish. When you frame a behavior change as, "I'm trying to use my phone less," you are fighting against a desire. When you frame it as, "I am someone who protects their attention," you are aligning with an identity. The former requires constant negotiation. The latter generates its own gravity. The question this week is, who are you becoming? Not who do you want to be someday, but who are you in the process of becoming right now, through these choices, in these days? Because identity and behavior are not separate. They build each other. You become what you repeatedly do, and what you repeatedly do is shaped by who you believe yourself to be. Keystone habits deserve special mention here. Researchers who study behavior change have noticed a striking phenomenon. Certain habits seem to have disproportionate positive effects, generating ripple effects that change other behaviors without any direct intention to do so. Exercise is the most thoroughly documented keystone habit. People who begin regular exercise, even modest, 3 Times week exercise, often spontaneously begin making better choices about diet, sleep, and substance use without specifically trying to change those behaviors. The reasons are partly physiological and partly psychological, but the pattern is consistent enough to be worth noting. Sleep is another keystone habit. Morning routines, structured journaling, and meditation practice have all been identified in various contexts as having outsized positive effects on the behaviors around them. This week, if you haven't already, identify your keystone habit, the single behavior that, when you do it consistently, most reliably generates positive momentum in other areas, and make it non-negotiable, not perfect, not performed under ideal conditions, just done. Because one of the most important discoveries in habit research is that consistency matters more than intensity. The person who exercises moderately 3 times a week for a year will reliably outperform, in terms of actual health outcomes, the person who exercises intensely for 3 weeks and then stops. The brain doesn't primarily respond to how hard you try on any given day. It responds to the pattern over time. The pattern builds the road. The role of implementation intentions is another empirically supported element of this week's work. Psychologist Peter Gollwitzer has spent decades studying the gap between intention and action, the phenomenon by which people who sincerely want to change a behavior nevertheless fail to do so consistently. His research has consistently found that one of the most powerful tools for closing this gap is what he calls if-then planning, explicitly specifying in advance what you will do, and when, and under what circumstances. Not, I intend to meditate more, but when I sit down at my desk in the morning, before I open anything on my computer, I will spend 10 minutes in quiet attention to my breath. The specificity matters. The brain responds differently to concrete plans than to abstract intentions, because concrete plans include the retrieval cues, the situational triggers that activate the behavior automatically. Environment design is also central to this week. One of the most consistent findings in behavioral science is that the easiest behavior in any given moment is the one that the environment makes easiest. Humans are, to a remarkable degree, creatures of their context. We do what is available, proximate, and effortless. This is not a weakness. It is a feature of cognitive architecture that allows us to operate efficiently in a complex world without having to consciously deliberate over every action. But it also means that if your environment makes unhealthy or unproductive behaviors the easiest option at every turn, you will default to those behaviors regardless of your intentions. Designing your environment means making the behaviors you want to perform easy, visible, accessible, prepared, and making the behaviors you want to avoid difficult, hidden, inconvenient, requiring extra steps to access. Put the book you want to read on your pillow. Put the phone in a different room during dinner. Set out your exercise clothes the night before. Delete the apps that pull you into mindless scrolling. These are not tricks. They are structural interventions in the conditions that determine your default behavior, and they work in ways that willpower-based strategies simply can't match because they operate at the level of context rather than at the level of conscious effort. This week, you are beginning to build a different architecture for your days. Not through force, but through design. Not through perfect discipline, but through the intelligent arrangement of your environment, your habits, and your identity in the direction you want to go. 30 days from now, the person who lives inside the architecture your building will find different things natural, different things automatic, different things satisfying. That is not a metaphor. That is the literal process of neural change unfolding in time. The fourth week of this reset is different from the first three in a way that is important to name clearly. The first 3 weeks have been largely about removing and replacing, reducing the noise, reclaiming the attention, beginning to install new patterns. The fourth week is about something that requires all of those foundations to already be in place. Building a stronger, more resilient, more emotionally grounded version of who you are. Discipline, in the fourth week, is not understood as punishment or as the suppression of desire. It is understood in its original sense, as a practice, in the way that a martial art or a meditation tradition is a practice. A structured engagement with difficulty that, over time, produces capacities you didn't have before. The Stoic philosopher Marcus Aurelius, a figure who had genuine authority to speak about the management of a difficult and demanding life, described discipline as the willingness to do what needs to be done regardless of how you feel about it in the moment. Not because feelings don't matter, but because giving the moment's feelings complete veto power over your actions is a recipe for never doing anything that requires effort or discomfort. This is a distinction worth holding carefully. There is a significant difference between suppressing emotions, pushing them down, refusing to feel them, using activity as a perpetual escape from your inner life, and choosing your behavior independently of your current emotional state. The first is a kind of violence against yourself. The second is a form of freedom. Emotional resilience is not the absence of difficult emotions. It is the capacity to feel them fully without being determined by them. To let sadness be sadness, anxiety be anxiety, frustration be frustration, without those states becoming the complete and final authority over what you do next. Neuroscientist Lisa Feldman Barrett, in her work on emotion, has described the brain as a prediction machine, an organ constantly generating models of what is about to happen based on past experience, and continuously updating those models in light of incoming information. Emotions, in this framework, are not things that happen to you from outside. They are the brain's way of representing its predictions about the current situation, its best guess, based on prior experience, about what is happening and what will happen next. This understanding has a profound practical implication. Your emotional responses are not inevitable or fixed. They are generated by a brain that is using past experience to interpret the present. When you change your relationship with your past experience, through the accumulation of new evidence about what you are capable of, what is actually threatening, what is worth pursuing, your brain's predictions, and therefore your emotional responses, begin to change as well. The experience of doing hard things and discovering that you are capable of them is one of the most direct routes to this kind of recalibration. Every time you sit with discomfort instead of escaping it, every time you do the thing you said you would do even when you don't feel like it, every time you stay with a difficult task past the point where the impulsive part of you wants to abandon it, you are generating new data for your brain's predictive model. You are providing evidence that you are capable of more than you previously believed. And over time, the cumulative weight of that evidence shifts the model, shifts the predictions, and shifts the person you experience yourself to be. Confidence, in this framework, is not something you find or acquire or stumble upon. It is something you build. through repeated evidence of your own competence and follow-through. It cannot be purchased, wished for, or shortcut. It can only be constructed through the daily accumulation of kept promises to yourself. This fourth week also asks you to examine your relationship with difficulty more broadly. The modern environment's orientation toward convenience and comfort has made many people subtly afraid of anything that feels hard, frustrating, or uncertain. Not consciously afraid, not the kind of fear that you can name clearly and reason about, but a low-grade aversion, a tendency to rout around difficulty whenever an alternative is available. And because an alternative is almost always available in a world of infinite distraction and convenience, this aversion goes largely unchallenged. The result, over time, is a gradual narrowing of your sense of what you can handle, a shrinking of the perceived circle of your competence. Voluntarily seeking out challenge is the antidote to this. Not extreme challenge, not manufactured suffering or performative discomfort, but the regular, voluntary encounter with things that are genuinely difficult for you, undertaken with the clear intention of developing the capacity to handle them. This might be a difficult physical practice. It might be a form of creative work that requires more of you than you know how to give yet. It might be a conversation you've been avoiding, a skill you've been telling yourself you're not good at, a form of solitude you find uncomfortable. The specific content matters less than the fact of voluntary engagement with your own edges, with the places where you meet resistance and turn back. The fourth week is also where the emotional work of this reset becomes most visible. Because as the noise quiets, as the distractions reduce, as you become more genuinely present with your own experience, things rise to the surface that the distraction has been suppressing. Feelings that were too uncomfortable to sit with, realizations that were easier not to have, questions about your life that you've been too busy to fully face. This is not a sign that things are going wrong. It is a sign that something is going profoundly right. You cannot address what you cannot see. You cannot heal what you never allow yourself to feel. The emotional content that rises when you stop running from your inner life is not an obstacle to your mental reset. It is, in many respects, the point of it. You don't have to solve everything that comes up this week. You just have to be willing to feel it without immediately escaping it. To hold it with the same curious, non-judgmental attention you've been practicing all month, and to trust that feeling it more fully is itself a form of resolution. Emotions that are allowed to complete their cycle, felt, acknowledged, expressed or processed appropriately, do not accumulate in the body and mind the way suppressed emotions do. They move through. The restlessness that drives so much of the distraction and escape of modern life is often at its root. Suppressed emotional content looking for a way out. When you give it a way out, the restlessness often follows. By the end of the fourth week, you are not the same person who began this reset. You couldn't be. The brain doesn't allow you to remain unchanged by what you consistently do to it. Something has shifted. In how you feel in the morning, in how long your focus can hold, in how quickly you're swept away by difficult emotions, in how reliably you follow through on the things you tell yourself you will do. The shift may be subtle in some areas, more pronounced in others, but it is real, and it is yours, built from your own sustained effort and your own accumulated days. Now let's talk about why it keeps working, why the changes you've made in 30 days don't just stop when the 30 days are over, but continue to compound and build in ways that produce returns far greater than what the initial investment might have suggested. The science of momentum in human behavior is grounded in several interconnected mechanisms, and understanding them will help you see your 30 days not as an endpoint, but as the beginning of something that, maintained and built upon, can genuinely transform the quality of your life. The first mechanism is neuroplasticity itself, revisited with new understanding. We established earlier that neurons that fire together wire together. That repeated activation of neural pathways strengthens them over time. What we haven't yet examined is the companion principle. The more a pathway is used, the more efficiently it transmits signals. This efficiency increases through a process called myelination, the coating of neural axons with a fatty substance called myelin that dramatically increases the speed and reliability of electrical transmission. Myelin is the physical substrate of skill and habit. Every time you perform a behavior, practice a skill, or travel a neural pathway, the opportunity for myelination increases. And as myelination increases, the behavior or skill becomes faster, easier, and more automatic. This is why experts in any domain make their work look effortless. They have built extraordinarily well myelinated neural pathways for the specific processes their expertise involves. This is also why the early stages of building any new habit feel so cognitively costly. You are working with unmyelinated pathways, slow, effortful, requiring conscious direction at every step. But the effort itself is what builds the myelin. The difficulty of the beginning is not wasted. It is the cost of construction. And once the pathway is built, once the myelin is in place, and the behavior begins to feel natural and automatic, the cost drops precipitously. The behavior that required enormous conscious effort in week 1 requires almost none in week 12. This is not because you've become lax. It is because the hardware has improved. The second mechanism is the compounding of small wins. Psychologist Teresa Amabil's research on the inner work life of people in organizations identified what she calls the progress principle. The finding that of all the things that influence motivation, mood, and engagement at work, the single most powerful is the perception of making progress on meaningful work, even incremental, apparently minor progress. A small win generates momentum. It shifts your perception of yourself as capable. It maintains your engagement with the larger goal, and it makes the next small action slightly easier. Conversely, a small failure or setback has a disproportionate negative effect when you're fragile, and a much smaller effect when you have a foundation of accumulated wins to draw on. 30 days of consistent action creates an enormous foundation, not because any single day is particularly spectacular, but because 30 days of showing up, even imperfectly, even partially, even on the days when it's hard, is meaningful evidence. It is the kind of evidence that changes how you see yourself, which changes what you believe you're capable of, which changes what you're willing to attempt, which produces more evidence in the same direction. This is the compounding loop that transforms a 30-day experiment into a genuinely different trajectory. The third mechanism is the recalibration of your dopamine system, which we touched on earlier and which deepens significantly over time. As you reduce the constant small hits of low-value stimulation and replace them with the slower, deeper satisfactions of meaningful work, genuine connection, physical health, and creative engagement, your reward system gradually recalibrates. The threshold for satisfaction drops, activities that seemed boring or insufficient before. Reading quietly, taking a walk, working on something without interruption, having a real conversation, begin to produce genuine pleasure again. Not because they've changed, but because your brain's reward circuitry has been reoriented toward them. This recalibration continues and deepens well beyond the first 30 days. People who sustain these changes for 6 months, a year, 2 years, often describe a qualitative shift in their relationship to daily life. A richness and depth of ordinary experience that they had forgotten was possible. The fourth mechanism is identity consolidation. As your behavior changes consistently over time, your sense of who you are begins to update to match the person you were performing as in week 1. Showing up to focused work, even when you didn't feel like it. Choosing presence over distraction, treating your attention as a precious resource, begins to feel less like a performance and more like simply who you are. This shift is gradual, sometimes imperceptible in the day-to-day, but it is real and it is consequential. Because once a behavior is part of your identity, rather than just your intention, maintaining it becomes dramatically easier. You don't have to negotiate with yourself about whether to do it. You just do it, the way you brush your teeth in the morning, because it's what you do, because it's who you are. James Clear, in his work on atomic habits, describes this shift beautifully. The goal of behavior change, he suggests, is not ultimately to achieve specific outcomes, but to become a specific kind of person. Every action is a vote for the kind of person you believe yourself to be. Enough votes in the same direction, and the identity changes. And when the identity changes, the actions that express it become effortless, in a way that willpower-driven behavior never can be. Finally, there is the mechanism of social and environmental reinforcement. As you change, the people around you and the environments you inhabit often begin to change in response. Not always, not automatically, but with a frequency that's worth acknowledging. You may find that the people in your life begin to engage with you differently as you become more present, more focused, more grounded. You may find that the environments you create for yourself, the physical spaces, the digital landscape, the social contexts, begin to reflect the person you're becoming rather than the person you were. And these external changes, in turn, reinforce the internal ones, creating a feedback loop between who you are and the world you inhabit that continues to push in the same direction. Momentum is not magic. It is not the universe rewarding you for trying. It is the predictable, mechanical output of consistent, cause-meeting consistent effect, accumulated over time. It is ordinary change compounding into extraordinary outcomes. And it is available to anyone willing to begin. 3 months had passed since Elijah's evening at his desk with the empty outline and the quiet sadness. They had been, by most external measures, unremarkable months. No dramatic events, no single day that stood out above the others. But the texture of the days had changed in a way that was hard to articulate precisely, because it showed up not in big moments, but in the quality of the ordinary ones. He woke up differently now, not every morning, not always cheerfully, but with a certain quality of arrival. A sense of being present in the day from the beginning rather than sliding into it through the fog of other people's content. He had moved his phone charger to the kitchen, which had felt like a small thing, and turned out to matter significantly. The first 20 minutes of his morning were now, consistently, his. He made coffee. He sat with it in something that wasn't quite meditation and wasn't quite nothing. Just a few minutes of being in the room with his own thoughts before anything else arrived. Sometimes a good idea would surface in that space. Sometimes nothing at all would surface, and that was fine too. His work had changed. Not the work itself, but his relationship to it. He had started time blocking his mornings. 90 minutes, phone in the other room. Email closed, a single task in front of him. The first week this had been genuinely difficult. His attention kept pulling toward the phantom of the phone, the imagined notification, the hypothetical email. But he had sat with the pull, let it be there, and returned his attention to the task. And gradually, not overnight, but gradually, the pull had quieted. The 90 minutes had begun to feel shorter. He'd started to find himself reaching a kind of depth in his work that he'd genuinely forgotten was possible. That absorbed quality, where time moved differently, and the thinking moved differently, and the output was something he could feel good about. The project he'd abandoned that evening months ago, the outline that had never been started, was now 12 pages of real work. He worked on it in the evenings, 3 times a week, for an hour and a half. Some evenings he came to it tired and made something mediocre. Most evenings he came to it and found that the act of beginning was enough to generate a kind of engagement he could build on. He had stopped waiting to feel ready. Readiness, he'd come to understand, was mostly something that arrived after you started, not before. He was on his phone less, not dramatically less. He still used it, still spent time on it, but differently. With more intention, more awareness of what he was actually choosing to do and why. He'd deleted a few apps he didn't miss. He checked the news once a day instead of continuously. The constant low-grade anxiety that the news had generated in him, the sense of perpetual crisis, of a world careening, had not disappeared, but it had quieted to something manageable, something he could hold without being defined by it. His sleep was better. He'd changed nothing dramatic about his routine. Just moved the phone to the kitchen and stopped looking at screens in the hour before bed. The improvement had surprised him with its speed and its magnitude. He woke feeling rested in a way he hadn't in years, and the quality of that rest changed everything else downstream. His friends had commented. Not on anything specific, exactly. More on a quality they couldn't quite name, but could feel. He seemed more present, one of them had said. Like there was more of him in the room. He had accepted the compliment without embarrassment and turned it over in his mind later, because it was accurate in a way that mattered to him. There was more of him in the room. The part of himself that had been continuously allocated to background noise, to the scroll and the refresh and the check and the re-check, was available again. It was available for the conversation he was actually in, for the person across the table, for the ideas that were actually worth thinking about. He wasn't fixed. He wasn't finished. He still got distracted, still had days where the fog came back thicker than usual, still caught himself scrolling without intention or procrastinating on something he knew mattered. But the relationship between those moments and the overall pattern of his days had changed. The fog came and went rather than staying. The distraction happened, and he noticed it and came back, rather than losing the whole hour to it. The bad days were nested inside a larger pattern of movement that he could feel, even when any given day wasn't evidence of it. On a Sunday morning 3 months, after the evening that had started everything, he finished a draft of a section of his project, put down his pen, and sat in the quiet of his apartment for a long moment. Outside, the city was doing what cities do in the morning, gradually warming, gathering itself, beginning to hum. He could hear it through the window he'd left open. He sat in that moment, without reaching for anything to fill it, without the reflexive movement toward stimulation, and let it be exactly what it was. It was enough. More than enough. It was, in fact, exactly what he'd been looking for all along. Not in the scroll or the refresh or the distraction, but here, in the simple quality of a morning, where he had been where he meant to be, and done what he meant to do, and was, in this moment, present for the result. He reached for his coffee. He looked out the window. He thought about what came next. Here is the deepest truth about your mind. It is never not changing. In this very moment, as you listen to these words, your brain is adapting. Synaptic connections are strengthening and weakening in response to what you're attending to. Patterns are being subtly reinforced or allowed to fade. The architecture of your cognitive future is being shaped incrementally by what is happening right now. This is not a comforting metaphor. It is a literal, ongoing biological process, and it means that the question is never whether you are changing. You are always changing. The question is only whether you are changing by accident or by design. Most people, for most of their lives, change largely by accident, not because they are passive or incurious or uncommitted to their own growth, but because the forces shaping their neural architecture are largely invisible to them. They don't see the habit loop completing itself automatically. They don't notice the dopamine calibration happening in response to their daily stimulation patterns. They don't observe the slow degradation of attentional capacity that happens when focus is never protected and distraction is never resisted. The change is happening silently and continuously, but they are not the ones directing it. A mental reset is a decision to direct it. It is the choice to become a deliberate participant in your own neural development. To take seriously the insight that what you repeatedly do and think and attend to is building the person you will be, and to begin making those repetitions intentional. 30 days is not a long time in the arc of a human life. It is not long enough to undo everything that decades of unconscious habit have built. It is not long enough to arrive at some finished, perfected version of yourself. Anyone who tells you otherwise is selling something that doesn't exist, and you should run in the opposite direction. But 30 days is long enough, genuinely long enough, to begin, to shift the direction, to build a foundation of new patterns that, maintained and deepened, can transform the quality of your cognitive life over months and years. What you have been exploring throughout this journey is not a list of techniques. It is a way of relating to your own mind, with curiosity rather than contempt, with patience rather than urgency, with the kind of long-view understanding that recognizes lasting change as something that emerges gradually from consistent effort, rather than something that arrives suddenly through the right intervention. Every thought you repeat becomes more likely to recur. Every emotion you express moves through you. Every emotion you suppress accumulates. Every distraction you indulge trains your brain to seek distraction. Every moment you return your attention to what matters trains your brain toward focus. Every time you avoid discomfort, you make the next avoidance more likely. Every time you sit with it, you build a slightly greater capacity to do so again. Every promise you keep to yourself adds evidence to a self-concept built on integrity. Every broken promise erodes it. The arithmetic of your daily choices is not mysterious, but it is merciless in its consistency, and it compounds over time in both directions. This is not meant to be frightening. It is meant to be clarifying, because clarity is what produces real motivation, not the anxious, self-punishing motivation of someone trying to escape their own inadequacy, but the grounded, forward-looking motivation of someone who understands the mechanism and chooses to work with it deliberately. You are not trying to be better because you are insufficient. You are working to become more of who you already are at your clearest, most focused, most present best, because that version of you is genuinely available to you, and because you now understand what it takes to get there. The brain you have today was built from everything you've done up to this moment. The brain you have a year from now will be built from everything you do between now and then. That is a profound responsibility and a profound opportunity. It is, in the truest sense, the invitation of a lifetime, not the invitation to become someone else, not the invitation to reach some idealized state of peak performance or perfect discipline, but the invitation to become increasingly, clearly, fully yourself, awake to your own experience, in command of your own attention, capable of the depth and the focus and the emotional groundedness that allow you to do the things that matter to you and be present for the life that is, even now, unfolding. 30 days may not make you perfect, but 30 days of intentional effort, real effort, honest effort, effort that tolerates setbacks and continues anyway, can begin transforming the most powerful, most plastic, most astonishing tool you will ever possess. Your mind. It is always changing. Make it change by design.